I have often wondered about the nature of hope and where it truly originates when the world goes completely dark. We are conditioned to look to the horizon for a hero on a white horse, to the sky for a sudden break in the clouds, or to the halls of power for a master strategist to deliver us from our suffering. But history and human experience tell a profoundly different story. Sometimes salvation does not descend from the heavens in a blaze of glory. Instead, it crawls out from the most wretched, forgotten, and desperate corners of human existence. To understand the magnitude of this truth, I must take you back to a time when hope wasn't just lost, but utterly suffocated beneath the crushing weight of a siege. We find ourselves in the ancient city of Samaria, the heart of the northern kingdom of Israel. The city is not just surrounded, it is being strangled by the massive, relentless army of Aram, commanded by King Ben-Hadad. The Arameans did not need to breach the walls with battering rams or scale them with siege towers. They understood a far more cruel and efficient arithmetic of war: patience. They simply drew a line around the city and waited for starvation to do the work of 1,000 swords. Inside the limestone walls of Samaria, the atmosphere is suffocating. I can almost feel the dry, oppressive heat of the sun beating down on a populace that has forgotten what it means to be full. The silence of the city is not the silence of peace, but the quiet of slow, agonizing death. The markets, once vibrant with the colors of spices, the bleating of livestock, and the lively banter of merchants, are now ghost towns of dust and despair. Inflation, driven by the absolute absence of supply, has reached a level of sheer madness. The economy of human dignity has completely collapsed. A donkey's head, an animal considered unclean, a piece of meat that in times of peace would be tossed to the wild dogs, now sells for 80 pieces of silver. A small cup of dove's dung, perhaps hoarded for the tiny, undigested seeds within it, or used as a desperate source of salt, commands 5 pieces of silver. People are scraping the very bottom of existence, trading their life's savings for refuse just to delay the inevitable by one more agonizing day. But physical hunger is only the beginning of the horror. When the stomach empties, the mind begins to fracture, and the thin veneer of human civilization peels away to reveal something terrifying beneath. The absolute lowest point of this tragedy, the moment that breaks the soul of the city, occurs during a seemingly ordinary walk along the city wall by King Joram. A woman cries out to him, not for justice against a thief, but with a dispute so horrifying it chills the blood. She and another mother, driven entirely mad by the hollow, gnawing pain in their bellies, had made a grotesque pact. They would boil and eat her son one day, and the other woman's son the next. She kept her agonizing end of the bargain, but the second woman hid her child. Upon hearing this, King Joram tears his royal robes, revealing the rough, scratchy sackcloth he wears tightly against his skin, a secret, desperate mourning he carries beneath the facade of his crown. His grief, however, instantly metastasizes into a blinding, irrational rage. He needs someone to blame. He cannot strike God, and he cannot defeat the Aramean army, so he directs his furious despair at the prophet Elisha. Joram vows to sever Elisha's head from his shoulders by nightfall, blaming the man of God for the silence of the heavens. In this enclosed cauldron of madness, cannibalism, and royal fury, the city of Samaria waits for its final bloody breath. Nobody is looking for a miracle anymore. They are only waiting for the end, while the king rages inside his palace and the citizens gnaw on the leather of their sandals. I want to pull our gaze away from the center of power and look toward the absolute fringes of this dying society. Just outside the massive wooden and iron gates of Samaria, sitting in the dust and the shadows of the encroaching evening, are 4 men. They are not soldiers. They are not politicians. They are lepers. In the ancient world, to contract leprosy was to be handed a death sentence that you had to live through. It was not merely a disease that ravaged the flesh, numbing the extremities and turning the skin white and necrotic. It was a total social and spiritual annihilation. The law dictated that they must be cast out, forbidden from living within the city walls, forced to wear torn clothes, and required to cover their lower faces and cry out, "Unclean! Unclean!" if anyone approached. They are the untouchables, the discarded remnants of humanity, existing in an agonizing purgatory. They are trapped in a deadly no-man's land. Behind them are the locked gates of a city that has expelled them, and in front of them is a vast, hostile army that would sooner run them through with a spear than look at them. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the dry earth, the chill of the evening begins to set into their frail, decaying bodies. They have received no food from the city gate for days. Why would the starving citizens spare a crumb for the dead walking among them? It is in this profound, chilling twilight that a conversation takes place. A conversation that I find to be one of the most remarkable displays of pragmatic, cold-blooded logic in all of history. Stripped of all societal expectations, religious posturing, and false hope, these 4 outcasts engage in the ultimate calculus of despair. One of them looks at the others and asks the only question that matters. Why sit we here until we die? They break down their options with the clarity that only comes to those who have absolutely nothing left to lose. If we say, "We will enter the city. The famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit still here, we die also." It is a flawless, irrefutable equation of doom. A equals death. B equals death. But then, a terrifying third variable is introduced. Now therefore come, and let us fall unto the host of the Arameans. If they save us alive, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. It is a brilliant, tragic philosophy born from the absolute bottom of the human experience. They realize that their greatest vulnerability, their imminent death, is actually their only remaining source of power. They cannot be threatened with death because they are already dead men. The Arameans might show a flicker of cruel mercy and toss them a scrap of bread, or they might simply execute them, which would only hasten the inevitable and end their suffering a few days early. They choose the path of active surrender over passive decay. As I observe their decision, I am struck by a profound realization. It is exactly at this moment, when all human striving ceases, when arrogance is starved out, and when one simply surrenders to the void, that the stage is perfectly set for the impossible. They use their trembling, numb limbs to push themselves up from the dirt, entirely unaware that their desperate, pathetic surrender is about to intersect with a divine symphony of terror. The twilight has now surrendered entirely to the deep, heavy darkness of the night. I watch in my mind's eye as the 4 lepers begin their agonizing journey towards the Aramean encampment. Every step is an immense physical effort. Their bodies are weak, their breathing is shallow, and their feet drag against the gravel. They walk in a state of absolute, terrified anticipation. With every crunch of a dry leaf, with every snap of a twig under their bandaged feet, their hearts hammer against their ribs. They expect a sentry to shout. They expect a dog to bark. They expect the sharp, sudden sting of an arrow piercing the darkness and ending their miserable existence. But as they draw closer to the flickering light of the camp's perimeter, a strange, suffocating anomaly blankets the air. There are no shouts. There are no patrols. There is only an eerie, vast silence, broken only by the soft snorting of tethered horses and the restless shifting of donkeys in the dark. To understand this surreal emptiness, we must shift our perspective back a few hours and look at the world through the eyes of the Aramean army. While the lepers were calculating their miserable odds of survival, a completely different reality was unfolding in the valley. God had orchestrated a miracle, but not one of fire or flood. He used the mind's most primal vulnerability, sound. He caused the entire Aramean camp to hear a terrifying, deafening acoustic illusion. It started as a low rumble in the earth, then escalated into the unmistakable, earth-shattering thunder of hundreds of heavy wooden chariot wheels crushing the stones. This was instantly accompanied by the frantic, chaotic drumming of thousands of war horses galloping at full speed and the battle cries of a massive, unseen infantry. Panic is a highly contagious disease, and in the span of moments, it infected the entire encampment. The Aramean generals and soldiers, sitting comfortably around their campfires, suddenly looked at each other with wide, terror-stricken eyes. The logic of fear took over instantly. They reasoned that the king of Israel must have emptied his secret treasuries and hired the fierce armies of the Hittites from the north and the Egyptians from the south to launch a devastating two-pronged surprise attack in the dead of night. The illusion was so perfect, so sonically overwhelming, that they did not pause to verify it. They did not send out scouts. The sheer volume of the phantom army shattered their discipline. In a frantic, uncoordinated scramble for survival, tens of thousands of seasoned warriors abandoned everything. They left their armor, their weapons, their tents, their silver, and even their horses tethered to the posts. They ran into the dark, tripping over themselves, shedding their garments as they fled toward the Jordan River, terrified that the phantom chariots were merely inches behind them. Now, returning to the present moment, the contrast is almost too poetic to bear. The mighty, terrifying Aramean army was chased away by a sound that never existed, leaving behind a kingdom of wealth to be discovered by 4 crippled, starving outcasts who are expecting nothing but the tip of a sword. The miracle was completely invisible, woven purely out of sound and fear, leaving the stage entirely empty for the weakest men on earth. The lepers stand at the edge of the first tent, their bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from the sheer disbelief of what their eyes are seeing. The tent flap is open, revealing a lantern still burning softly inside. They cautiously step in, bracing for a trap, but the space is completely devoid of human life. What they find instead is an assault on their starved senses. Before them sits a table laden with abandoned rations, perhaps roasted meats still warm on the plate, fresh bread, bowls of dried fruit, and heavy jugs of rich, sweet wine. For men who have been subsisting on dust and the prospect of death, this is a sensory overload of unimaginable proportions. I imagine the initial shock giving way to a primal, animalistic frenzy. They do not sit politely. They fall upon the food. They tear into the meat, chewing and swallowing without tasting, letting the wine spill down their chins and soak into their rags. It is the raw, unadulterated ecstasy of pure survival. When the screaming agony in their stomachs is finally silenced, another deeply human instinct kicks in: greed. As they wipe their mouths and look around, the lantern light catches the glint of silver coins, heavy gold jewelry, and piles of exquisitely woven Syrian garments. They are rich. Instantly, the outcasts become hoarders. They gather the treasures into their arms, scurrying out into the darkness like thieves in the night, digging frantic holes in the soft earth to bury their newfound wealth. They return to a second tent, eat again, drink again, and carry out more silver to bury. For a fleeting hour, They are kings of an empty empire, reveling in the intoxicating illusion of security that wealth brings to those who have always been poor. But then, the frenzy breaks, the adrenaline subsides, and in the profound quiet of the abandoned camp, a heavy, uncomfortable stillness descends upon them. The darkness, which had just offered them untold riches, now begins to press against their conscience. They stop digging. They look at each other, the silver slipping from their dirt-caked fingers. One of them finally speaks, giving voice to the guilt that is suddenly choking them. We are not doing right. It is a stunning moment of moral clarity. Here are men who have been spat upon, banished, and left to die by the very citizens of Samaria. They owe that city absolutely nothing but bitterness and resentment. Yet, the memory of the starving children, the desperate mothers, and the weeping king inside those walls crashes down upon them. This day is a day of good news, they reason, and we are keeping it to ourselves. They recognize that if they wait until morning light to share this salvation, while thousands perish in the dark, some profound divine punishment will surely fall upon them. I am deeply moved by this turning point. It speaks to a resilience of the human spirit that disease could not rot away. Despite being stripped of their humanity by their own people, they refuse to lose their own humanity in return. They choose grace over vengeance. They leave the buried gold in the dirt, turn their backs on the banquet, and begin the long, limping trek back toward the city that had cast them out. The journey back to the gates of Samaria is fueled by an entirely different kind of adrenaline. It is no longer the fear of death that pushes them forward, but the urgent, explosive weight of the news they carry. When they finally reach the towering, locked doors of the city, it is still the dead of night. They raise their voices, shouting up into the blackness toward the high walls. The watchmen, likely dozing in their own hunger-induced stupor, are startled awake. The lepers scream their unbelievable report through the heavy timber. We came to the camp of the Arameans, and behold, there was no man there, neither voice of man, but horses tied, and asses tied, and the tents as they were. The porters immediately relay the message inward, the shouts echoing down the empty, narrow streets, until they reach the inner sanctum of the king's house. King Joram is dragged from his fitful sleep, but the news does not bring him the immediate joy one might expect. When a person has lived in a state of prolonged trauma and despair, good news often looks exactly like a threat. The king's mind, battered by the horrors he has witnessed and poisoned by his own cynicism, immediately filters the report through a lens of extreme paranoia. I can see him pacing the stone floors of his chamber, shaking his head. He refuses to believe in grace. He refuses to believe in miracles. He looks at his emaciated advisors and presents a perfectly logical, yet entirely flawed, military assessment. I will now show you what the Arameans have done to us, he declares bitterly. They know that we are starving. Therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we shall take them alive and get into the city. It makes perfect sense to a mind accustomed only to cruelty. He believes it is a sophisticated ambush, a cruel bait designed to draw the starving populace out into an open slaughter. But hunger has a way of cutting through royal paranoia. One of his captains, a man who has clearly weighed the inevitability of death by starvation against the slight possibility of an ambush, steps forward. His logic mirrors that of the lepers earlier that evening. He suggests taking 5 of the few remaining horses that are so starved they are essentially walking skeletons, destined to die anyway, just like the rest of the city's multitude. Let us send and see, the captain urges. If the men die in the ambush, they are no worse off than if they stayed in the city to starve. King Joram, exhausted and devoid of any better strategy, finally relents. 2 chariots are prepared in the gloom. The gates creak open just enough to let the horses slip through into the dangerous night. As the scouts ride out towards the silent valley, the entire city of Samaria holds its collective breath. It is a waiting period of absolute agony. Thousands of people stand in the dark, caught in the terrifying space between the agonizing certainty of death and the blinding, painful possibility of life. The sky begins to lighten, turning from charcoal black to a bruised, dusty purple as the king's scouts follow the trail of the missing Aramean army. They do not just find an empty camp. They find a landscape painted with the chaotic frenzy of a mass exodus. The road leading all the way down to the Jordan River is littered, mile after mile, with the debris of panic. Heavy bronze armor, shields, weapons, finely woven cloaks, and discarded supplies are scattered haphazardly across the dirt. It is undeniable proof. It is not an ambush. It is a total, miraculous rout. The scouts turn their exhausted horses around and ride furiously back to Samaria, carrying the morning sun and the confirmation of salvation with them. When they deliver the news to King Joram, the final barrier of doubt shatters. The command is given. The heavy iron bars are lifted, and the great gates of Samaria are thrown wide open. What happens next is not an orderly military procession. It is the violent, unstoppable eruption of a desperate populace. Like a massive dam that has suddenly burst, the starving citizens of Samaria flood out of the city. I see a tidal wave of humanity, men, women, and children, screaming, crying, and trampling over one another in a manic sprint toward the Aramean camp. They descend upon the abandoned tents like locusts, plundering the food, the grain, the silver, and the gold. Within hours, the impossible economic prophecy delivered the day before by Elisha, the prophet comes true to the exact letter. A measure of fine flour sells for a single shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, right there at the gate of Samaria. The economy of death is instantly replaced by an overwhelming abundance. But amidst this chaotic salvation, there is a dark, tragic note of poetic justice. King Joram had appointed his chief officer, the very man on whose arm he leaned, the same cynical lord who had sneered at Elisha's prophecy of cheap grain by saying, "Even if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? To take charge of the city gate?" He was placed there to maintain order, an impossible task. The rushing, starving mob, blinded by the scent of life, does not see his authority. They do not care for his rank. The crowd surges forward, and the officer is violently knocked to the ground. The desperate feet of his own people trample him to death in the dust of the gateway. He sees the miracle with his own eyes, just as the prophet said he would, but he does not get to taste a single crumb of it. As the sun rises fully over a saved city, I am left reflecting on the profound paradox of this story. The mighty king with his armies could do nothing. The brilliant military strategists were paralyzed. The man of power who demanded logical proof was crushed. In the end, it was 4 dying men, broken by disease, exiled by their peers, and stripped of all dignity, who became the harbingers of life. They moved when no one else would. They surrendered when fighting was useless, and by simply walking into the dark, they stumbled upon a miracle that nobody expected, proving once again that when humanity reaches the absolute end of its strength, the stage is finally set for grace to begin.